Today is May 18th, 2026, and the most consequential economic confrontation of the current geopolitical moment is not happening in the Taiwan Strait. It is not happening in the war-torn fields of Eastern Europe, where drone swarms define the baseline of modern attrition. And it is certainly not happening in the contested shipping lanes of the Red Sea, where global commerce routinely dodges missile fire. It is happening in the space between two sentences spoken by two different leaders. In Ottawa, the public declaration was loud, confident, and draped in the language of economic nationalism. Prime Minister Mark Carney stood before Parliament and announced that Canada was entering a new era of absolute resource autonomy. He declared, "Canada will no longer be an economic appendix to the whims of Washington. Our resources, our infrastructure, and our capital are sovereign, self-contained, and unstoppable." But then came the response from Washington. It was not a late-night social media tirade. It was not a chaotic press conference. Instead, Donald Trump issued a quiet, deadpan, and chillingly calculated one-sentence warning from the Oval Office. He looked directly into the lens, unblinking, and said simply, "The misreading will be expensive." But let's back all the way up, because to understand why Trump signed a $94 billion redirection deal is reverberating through financial markets and corporate boardrooms, you need to understand what was decided in secret weeks before. Ottawa believed it held an unassailable hand. Under the technical mechanisms of the newly adjusted Canadian Income Tax Act, specifically paragraph 12, section 1A, and the updated Export and Import Permits Regulation, the Canadian government executed a quiet, surgical restructuring of their critical mineral and clean energy trade architecture. They didn't call it a blockade. They called it a strategic domestic retention framework. The math behind this policy was brutal. It effectively mandated a 25% domestic processing requirement for all rare earth elements, lithium and raw aluminum, before any export permits could be authorized for southern transit. Overnight, this policy threatened to trigger a sudden structural drop in cross-border manufacturing flows. We are talking about a projected disruption to the tune of tens of billions of dollars in highly integrated supply chains. But here's the thing. The true intent of Ottawa's policy went far deeper than simple protectionism. It was a calculated attempt to shift the structural balance of power in North America. For decades, the assumption in Washington was that the northern border was a secure, predictable conveyor belt of raw inputs. Ottawa's new legislative framework turned that assumption on its head. It treated the United States not as a premium partner, but as a captive market, an economic colony that would have no choice but to absorb the inflated costs of Canadian processing hubs. They believed the American industrial base was too fragile, too dependent on their natural resources to ever pivot away. It was a bold, mathematical gamble. They assumed Washington would panic, sue for peace, and accept the new terms of a lopsided economic codependence. They truly believed they were unstoppable. But macroeconomic models look very different when they finally hit the ground. Let us zoom in from the high-altitude corporate boardrooms to a gravel parking lot just outside Detroit, Michigan. Meet Robert. He is a 52-year-old logistics coordinator who has spent the last 3 decades managing the precision arrival of specialized aluminum components flowing daily from refineries in Quebec directly into American automotive assembly lines. His job relies on a sequence calibrated down to the minute. On the morning of the implementation, Robert sat in the cab of his diesel truck for 40 minutes in absolute silence. The manifest on his dashboard was dead. The cross-border customs system had just flagged his entire shipment for an indefinite compliance review under Ottawa's new regulatory mandate. Outside, the rain was hitting the windshield, but inside the cab, the silence was heavy, suffocating. In that 40-minute window, Robert wasn't analyzing gross domestic product fluctuations or reading geopolitical white papers. He was processing a brutal 3-word realization that had just altered his entire life. He looked at the empty digital routing map and thought, "We are being replaced." While Ottawa celebrated its apparent legislative victory, a completely different process was unfolding inside the West Wing. The popular caricature of Donald Trump is a leader who reacts instantly with loud, public outrage. But that caricature is a strategic miscalculation. When the stakes are existential, the response changes entirely. Trump did not raise his voice. He did not issue an immediate retaliatory tariff order to the press. Instead, those close to the administration noted a specific stillness, a calculated composure that settles over the room when the real chess game begins. Why? Because Trump operates on a fundamental rule of elite negotiation. The first person to show urgency loses. He belongs to rooms where showing your hand early is a fatal error. He isolated himself in the private dining room off the Oval Office, surrounded not by political speechwriters, but by cold, analytical trade lawyers and supply chain architects. He read the entire Canadian document from cover to cover in isolation. He didn't look for political talking points. He looked for the structural friction points, the precise vulnerabilities that Ottawa's bureaucratic model had failed to account for. And then he bypassed Ottawa completely. Over the course of 72 hours, without a single press leak, Trump made a series of quiet, calculated phone calls to alternative capitals. He spoke directly to leadership in Tokyo, in Seoul, in Brasilia. He didn't ask for favors. He presented raw, operational math. He laid out a blueprint that would systematically divert billions of dollars in capital away from the Northern Corridor, permanently rewriting the flow of global industry. While Canada was playing to the domestic gallery, Washington was quietly assembling an industrial execution squad. The response that followed was not an emotional retaliation. It was a cold, systematic demolition of Ottawa's assumptions, executed through 6 precise chronological maneuvers. Every single move was framed not as a hostile trade war tactic, but as a routine, calculated exercise of sovereign economic policy. Move 1. The execution of an immediate supply chain compliance audit under federal executive authority. Trump signed an order directing the Department of Commerce to review every single Canadian import under strict national security guidelines. This wasn't a tariff. It was a rigorous, hyper-precise inspection regime that slowed border processing to a crawl, turning Canada's logistical advantage into an expensive, bureaucratic bottleneck. Move 2. The signature of the $94 billion American Industrial Redirection Act. This was the hammer. Trump authorized a massive $94 billion emergency sovereign fund designed to do one thing: completely decouple domestic advanced manufacturing from northern dependencies. This fund did not just sit in a bank account. It was deployed instantly as direct capital grants to build massive domestic rare earth processing facilities within the borders of the United States. Move 3. The fast-tracking of alternative international trade corridors. Trump utilized the sovereign fund to finalize exclusive, long-term, critical mineral agreements with Australia and Brazil. By offering guaranteed federal purchase contracts at fixed prices, Washington effectively neutralized Canada's raw material leverage. The message to the markets was unmistakable. The United States did not need the Northern Corridor anymore. Move 4. The implementation of quiet, reciprocal capital flow restrictions. Under the guise of federal financial stability oversight, the Treasury Department began investigating Canadian institutional investments in American infrastructure. This move subtly restricted the ability of Canadian pension funds to park their wealth in high-yield American assets, hitting Ottawa's financial core exactly where it hurt the most. Move 5. The quiet boardroom calls. Trump and his economic advisors held private teleconferences with the chief executive officers of the top 10 aerospace and automotive conglomerates in the world. The pitch was simple, direct, and entirely devoid of sentimentality. Trump laid out the exact math of the $94 billion redirection fund, showing these executives that remaining dependent on Canadian suppliers would mean losing billions in federal tax credits and state-backed procurement contracts. The corporations did the math out loud and began drafting relocation plans. Move 6. the formal, permanent structural recalibration of domestic industrial security frameworks. The administration codified the absolute independence of the American energy and manufacturing grid into federal law, ensuring that no future administration could easily reverse the decoupling. Weeks later, the market and corporate realities hit back with brutal force. Ottawa's entire strategy had relied on a fundamental miscalculation. They believed that global markets would respect political timelines. They thought American corporations would lobby Washington to cave rather than endure a temporary supply disruption. But they forgot that capital has no loyalty to geography. It only seeks predictability. While the Canadian government was trapped in bureaucratic review cycles, celebrating their sovereign framework on cable news, Trump's operational readiness was already yielding results. The $94 billion redirection deal acted as a massive gravitational pull. The corporate boardrooms didn't wait for Canada to lower its tariffs or ease its export permits. They simply adjusted their capital expenditure budgets. Billions of dollars earmarked for expansion projects in Ontario and Quebec were quietly frozen overnight. Instead, that money began flowing into new, highly subsidized processing plants in Ohio, Texas, and Arizona. Now look at this. The sudden, forced disruption didn't cripple the American industrial base as Ottawa had predicted. Instead, it acted as an unexpected, high-velocity catalyst. By forcing a total, accelerated decoupling, the $94 billion deal accidentally forced the United States to build a much more resilient, diversified, and durable industrial architecture than what had existed before. The old vulnerabilities were erased. The supply chains were no longer long, exposed, and subject to foreign political whims. They were compact, heavily subsidized, and completely sovereign. Canada's attempt to leverage its resource wealth had achieved the exact opposite of its intended goal. It had transformed them from an indispensable, unstoppable partner into an isolated onlooker, watching the world's largest economy build an impregnable fortress right next door. In every geopolitical chess match, there is always a single, unscripted moment that becomes the visual proof of the asymmetry and preparation between both sides. For this conflict, that moment occurred during a routine press briefing in Ottawa, just 3 weeks after Trump signed the redirection deal. The Canadian government's chief economic spokesperson stood at the podium, attempting to reassure international investors that the domestic economy remained entirely stable. Then, a senior financial journalist stood up and asked a devastatingly precise arithmetic question. The journalist asked, given that $94 billion in American capital is now actively replicating our entire critical mineral processing capacity within domestic United States borders, what is the exact timeline for Canada to find alternative buyers for our raw surplus before our regional refineries collapse into insolvency? What followed was a distinct, prolonged, and agonizing silence. It was a 4-second pause. For 4 full seconds, the spokesperson simply stared down at their notes, the color visibly draining from their face, as the cameras clicked in unison. The silence said everything that the official talking points could not. It revealed a total absence of an operational backup plan. When the spokesperson finally spoke, they dodged the question entirely, offering generic platitudes about ongoing bilateral dialogues. But the damage was done. Contrast that awkward, desperate silence with the absolute clarity emanating from Washington. Every time Trump was asked about the border bottleneck, his response was consistent, unwavering, and mathematically cold. He didn't gloat. He just reiterated the numbers. The asymmetry was total. One side was drowning in a sea of unexpected calculations, while the other was simply watching a pre-programmed algorithm execute its objective. When you strip away the political theater and the loud rhetoric, the final picture becomes clear. The laws and the incentives passed by the Canadian government were real. They thought those policies would render them unstoppable on the North American continent. But the massive operational counter-effects triggered by Trump's $94 billion redirection deal are equally real and far more durable. Geopolitics does not reward good intentions or romantic notions of sovereign leverage. It rewards scale, operational speed, and the cold willingness to deploy massive capital to protect national interests. Ottawa built an elaborate bureaucratic trap, assuming their neighbor would walk right into it. Instead, Washington simply bypassed the trap, rebuilt the road, and left Canada holding the bill for an infrastructure network that no longer has a premium buyer. It all loops back to that quiet, deadpan warning issued from the Oval Office before the first signature was even dry on the executive order. The misreading will be expensive. The only thing still being determined is how expensive and for whom.